Gentlemen, welcome to Fuller Theological Seminary. Thank you so much for being with us. This opportunity we have John Swinton and Brian Brock, both from University of Aberdeen, and they are both very accomplished scholars in their disciplines, and both have to do with practical theology and ethics. And we're going to have a conversation about two books and also the practice of practical theology and qualitative research. As we have this conversation, I'd like to begin asking uh, what would you say motivates you to look into these disciplines? Your personal take on why is this important?
The discipline of practical theology.
Yes.
Well, it's important that for me because one of the things that fascinates me about theology is not just how you think about it, but what it looks like. And so, I'm always fascinated to listen to and be with systematic theologians and ethicists and look at the way in which they abstract and conceptualize. I mean, these things are very, very important. But then I like to ask the question, what does it look like? So if you have an understanding that God is love, for example, and you have a beautiful conceptual framework to help to explain that, unless you can see what it looks like, then nobody's really going to understand it. And so there is a sense in which something like love is a concept, but it's also not a concept because it's a practice. So the thing I like about practical theology is that it helps us to experiment with these, what does theology look like, what does it feel like, and when we think about what it looks like and feels like, how do we understand that in the light of what we know and what we construct. So I just think it's flexible, it's imaginative, it's creative, just a nice way of doing theology, but it's also transformative.
Mm. And you did not use this descriptor, but let me add it and hear your comment. It's also messy.
Life's messy. That's right. Human beings are messy. It is, and it's a strange discipline in practical theology because when you look at the different ways that people do it, the different methods people use, the approaches, the focus, it's not like being a physicist. It's just there's a whole kind of mess and combination of different ways in which practical theology is done. But I think that just reflects the complexities of being human. And practical theology always focuses on humanness and human beings and what goes on in the world and what God's doing in the world. So it's inevitably messy. But the messiness is a good place to be because out of messiness comes order, and that order is always surprising.
And for Brian, how do you feel about such characterization, and what is your own characterization?
Well, I was trained as a theological ethicist, but hired as a practical theologian. So I feel that I've learned from you two gentlemen in great measure some just skills and techniques of making sure that our doctrinal and conceptual affirmations, we like John said, are aware of how they're being deployed. And I've increasingly been trying to ground those general sensibilities in the doctrinal tradition, to remind us that at least it was very strong in the Reformation that we know what we confess, but we often don't understand what our confession actually means in life. So it's one thing to confess Christ is Lord of all things. It's an entirely different thing to understand what that might mean in relation to a specific question or in relation to our own culturally acquired sensibilities. And so I think, for me, I think what I've learned from you both in various ways is that practical theology is a cognate of pastoral theology, and pastoral theology is helping the church understand how its conceptual and doctrinal claims are connecting to its lived life.
Thank you. John, when you think of your particular book, Practical Theology and Qualitative Research, that you work with Harriet Mowat, what kind of impact have you learned the book has had? I can give you my testimony, but I will wait for what can you tell us? What kind of impact this book has had on the discipline, on the academy?
Well, I think it's had a measurable impact in the sense that it's used a lot internationally. So wherever I go, people talk about it. So it's used within courses in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the US and beyond. So at that level, I can see it doing some work. The other side of that is there's not very many books that bring together practical theology and qualitative research. So if somebody came out with a wonderful new book, then that book would probably find a different place. But at the moment, it fills a niche that's probably not being filled. My sense is that it's doing some work, and it's opening up that question of, if you're going to use qualitative research, what role does theology have there? Or more importantly, actually, if you're going to do theology, what role does qualitative research have in that process? And I think it's contributing to the conversation.
It seems to me, as a student of the book and as a reader of the book and as a lover of you and what you say here, along with Mowat, whom I don't know, that it is central, the concept of triangulation.
Yeah.
Both of you have talked about how love as a doctrine and the doctrines of the church have to be lived out. And the triangulation process is the epistemological definition of what we're doing in practical theology, as I read you. And also it is the process to be used in interpreting the narratives that we gather. What could you tell us about this triangulation process of bringing the social sciences, the narratives, and the theological framework?
Yeah. I mean, the book really is how intended to teach Christians to look at the world properly, or rather, maybe not even that, maybe not to look at the world at all, and to recognize the world as creation. So moving away from world creation, but by giving people the tools to explore and complexify things that they think are very ordinary and very normal. So the triangulation, the type of triangulation you're talking about, is just simply a way of looking at things from different angles. So it's a way of reframing issues by using different voices and different perspectives. And when you reframe something, you see it differently. Reframing in psychotherapy happens when you get to the end of the process and you can't do anything else. It's an interminable problem. But if you give the person another angle to look at it, suddenly they see things. They see things they could never see before. And that's really where the way that practical theology does. It complexifies, it changes our perspective and opens up new ways of seeing things. And the interesting thing in terms of the way that the book's written is that Harriet is a sociologist who has expertise in qualitative research, and I'm a practical theologian. So the triangulation that we try to explore and expound in the book actually comes out of a relationship. And so it's only because we are able to develop good relationships, we've been friends for a long time, we're able to have hospitable conversations across these two disciplines that we're able to facilitate that. So triangulation in that sense is a relational thing, I think, sometimes, rather than simply a methodological a tool to do things.
It is embodied.
It's embodied.
And this process of embodiment of this triangulation in a team cannot always be replicated.
That's right.
A doctoral student writing a dissertation may be working alone in the field and doing the analysis. What words of wisdom will you say about the triangulation process when you're doing it by yourself?
Well, I suppose it's a little bit like theological reflection, really. The way I would say it, theological reflection, put simply, could be put as, you can imagine that you're sitting in the room with a group of theologians, Augustine, Barth, Bonhoeffer, whomsoever it is, and you're asking them questions around the issue that you're looking at, and they're giving you responses, and you're interacting with the responses in that sense. So it becomes an ongoing critical conversation, and it's critical because you're not agreeing with them, they're not agreeing with you. And you can think of the theological reflection as something along these lines. In terms of triangulation, exactly the same thing. Qualitative research is a huge field, It's controversial. It's epistemologically controversial. It is filled with different methods and different approaches. What a student needs to do is to sit down with 3 or 4 recognized scholars with different perspectives and engage in that conversation. Ask them questions, bring your own issues to them, take their answers, engage with it. And I think out of that process, you can begin to have that kind of conversation and begin to, if you like, get into the habit of conversing with others. I mean, ideally, for your students, you should have maybe a qualitative research group where people can do that in real life. But really, it's just teaching yourself to engage conversationally with a wide range of perspectives, and then begin to see what that looks like when you're looking.
While the course is happening, yes, they have that privilege and opportunity, but they will eventually be doing their research
That's right.
on their own. But this conversation that you are describing comes from the hundreds of hours of reading
That's right.
of the different authors, and then framing it as a conversation.
Yeah.
That would be the tool.
That's right. And that's the way to do it. I think that's the way it's in your mind, just thinking this is a conversation. So critical thinking has to do with engaging in a particular form of conversation in order that you can gain the right tools to help you to look at the world properly.
When you think of ethical issues in this process and questions of defining what is truth, you come from a discipline, you were trained to begin with at Calvin and then at Loma Linda University to look at it at a particular perspective. How does that dialogue with that perspective that you learn with this perspective and the epistemology of both?
Well, one thing that training as an ethicist helps you to do is focus on the moments where you feel you're being faced with a discrete choice of some variety. Now, on the one hand, you can. I think the discipline tends to fall into taking those moments as the entire orbit of its remit, to look at those moments and try to say conceptually intelligent things about how to handle those moments. And I think one place my own trajectory parallels the questions you guys are raising is that I want to question that moment or the clarity of that moment. That often the real forks in the road happen to us when we weren't paying attention, and sometimes the things that we think really are morally problematic are false questions. And so the only way you can get at the deeper question of how we come to have the sensation that we're facing a moral question is to go into the territory that you guys are raising. Because ultimately what counts as a moral question is something that we inherit. And we can consciously engage in thinking about the traditions in which we've inherited those questions, but that never gets to the bottom, right? Because we learn new questions from different people. Part of what I agree, I think John and I are thinking along the same lines, that part of what it means to be a theologian is to let Christians from other times and places help us to form better questions. So for instance, we've been talking about disability, and if you look back at the patristic period, you realize very early on, and in a very untheorized way, Christians were anti-abortion, but not at all in the way modern sort of Western American Christians are anti-abortion, but in the sense that they were also, for the same reason, against gladiatorial fights. So what does it mean to have a church that's very strongly anti-abortion and also having cage fighting ministries, right? That's a quite different complex of underlying beliefs that generate quite different moral problems, even though at one level of the moral question they seem to be the same. And so I think these empirical research has always been part of what it means for Christians to live in the world. They're watching how things play out, and I would take the modern discipline of practical theology to have elaborated that methodologically, but not to be different in kind from what Christians have been doing for thousands of years.
So we're bringing a question when we come to the practical theology method. And this question is not innocent. This question comes from our own biases and history. And as we do that, we have a dialogue with what we have learned through the narratives that we have collected.
Mhm.
Are there any parting ideas that you would like to say as we conclude this short dialogue and introduction to the concepts? Would you like to say something else to our students?
Only in terms of qualitative methods, just to bear in mind that a method is simply a tool to access information. So it's not in itself, it's only important for what it can do. So if you're going to dig a hole, you need the right size spade and an appropriate spade. So you don't want to be digging a hole with a teaspoon. So methods are part of the constructive, creative, theological process that enables us to identify what aspects of qualitative research are useful for this theological issue, and that can throw light on the midst of that. So don't get too caught up in methods other than as ways of helping you to see things more clearly.
Thank you so much.